What Kristi Noem's daughter Cassidy said about Jesus has spiraled into something no one could have seen coming. Not her family, not her political allies, and certainly not the crowd that had gathered to hear her speak that crisp October evening in Sioux Falls. In an era where religious language is often used like a campaign bumper sticker, recycled, rebranded, and weaponized, Cassidy's raw honesty felt both jarring and refreshing. She didn't deliver her message with the carefully polished tone of a preacher or a politician. She spoke like someone who had been wrestling privately with something sacred, something real, and finally couldn't keep it buried any longer. That's what made her words so electrifying. They weren't crafted, they were confessed. The event itself was supposed to be routine, a youth rally at the First Baptist Church, part of a series of appearances designed to boost her mother's political profile among evangelical voters. The sanctuary was packed with families, teenagers, and community leaders, all expecting the standard fare of inspirational platitudes and patriotic fervor. Instead, they witnessed something unprecedented, a moment of spiritual authenticity that would fracture the carefully constructed facade of political Christianity. What truly stunned the audience was not just what she said, but how she said it. There was no applause line, no slow, deliberate pauses for effect. She spoke as if she were speaking into a mirror, honest, exposed, vulnerable. "I was raised to believe in Jesus as a king," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had spent sleepless nights grappling with profound questions. "But somewhere along the way, I started noticing that we treat him more like a mascot. We drag him into debates he never asked to be in. We put him on signs, on shirts, on stages, but we forget to put him in our hearts." At that moment, something shifted in the room. The crowd went silent, not out of disrespect, but because there was no defense against such naked truth. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped. The usual background noise of rustling programs and shifting seats ceased entirely. Even the children seemed to sense that something important was happening. Some attendees blinked slowly, trying to process what they were hearing. Others looked away, as if her words were making them uneasy, or maybe too aware of the contradictions in their own lives. Pastor Williams, who had introduced her just minutes earlier with glowing praise for the Noem family's commitment to Christian values, sat frozen in his chair, his prepared closing remarks suddenly feeling inadequate. There was no easy way to shrug off what she said. That's what made it so powerful, and so dangerous, at least to those who benefit from maintaining the illusion that politics and piety are always aligned. Cassidy wasn't rejecting faith. She was challenging its misrepresentation. She wasn't renouncing Jesus. She was calling out those who've distorted him for personal, political, or cultural gain. "When did we start believing that loving our neighbors meant voting for specific candidates?" she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "When did we decide that the gospel was about winning culture wars instead of winning hearts? Jesus said his kingdom was not of this world, but we've tried so hard to make this world his kingdom that we've forgotten what his kingdom actually looks like." The silence that followed was deafening. Some in the audience shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned forward, hungry for more. A few elderly women in the front row nodded almost imperceptibly, as if they'd been waiting years for someone to voice what they'd been thinking but never dared to say. And what followed was a storm. The video of her speech, originally recorded by a teenager in the fourth row on an old iPhone, spread with wildfire intensity across social media platforms. The grainy footage, with its imperfect audio and shaky camera work, somehow made her words feel more authentic, more real than any professionally produced content. Overnight, conservative forums lit up with outrage. Liberal faith communities posted messages of support. Even apolitical observers found themselves caught in the gravity of the moment. This wasn't just a political daughter having a spiritual epiphany. It was a rupture, a crack in the tight, unified image Kristi Noem's team had spent years constructing. And it couldn't be repaired with a press release. Within 24 hours, right-wing pundits were calling it the betrayal of the decade. One podcast host went so far as to accuse Cassidy of joining the war on Christianity, completely missing the irony of his own words. Cable news shows dedicated entire segments to analyzing her motives. Was this a calculated move to distance herself from her mother's politics? Was she being coached by liberal activists? Or was this simply the authentic voice of a young woman who had grown tired of the performance? But the irony in the accusation of betrayal was hard to miss, because what Cassidy had done wasn't an attack. It was a plea for authenticity, for spiritual humility, and for a return to the basics that had somehow gotten lost in the noise of partisan politics. Jesus wasn't on a ballot, she had said, her words now being quoted in newspapers across the country. He didn't come to win elections. He came to love, to challenge, to serve, and to save. So why do we act like he's a political consultant instead of the Prince of Peace? The theological implications of her statement weren't lost on seminary professors and religious scholars, who began dissecting her words with the same intensity usually reserved for biblical exegesis. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a theology professor at Princeton Seminary, wrote in a widely shared blog post, "What Kristi Noem articulated in 15 minutes is what many of us have been trying to say for years, that the gospel has been co-opted by political agendas that have nothing to do with the radical love and justice that Jesus actually preached." Some said she was naive. Others said she was brave. Political strategists called her reckless. Theologians called her prophetic. But all agreed she was not silent. And in an age where silence often equals safety, her choice to speak was seen as an act of spiritual rebellion that echoed the tradition of biblical prophets who challenged the religious establishment of their time. The ripple effects didn't stop in South Dakota. Across college campuses and youth ministries, young people started quoting her. Her speech was transcribed, printed, and even turned into a spoken word video by a Christian artist on YouTube that garnered millions of views. The hashtag Authentic Faith began trending, with thousands of posts from young Christians sharing their own struggles with the intersection of faith and politics. One pastor in Atlanta began his Sunday sermon with her line, "When faith becomes about who you're against instead of who you're for, we've already lost our way." That quote hit home for many, especially in congregations tired of culture wars, tired of fear-based theology, and tired of being told who to hate in the name of a man who taught nothing but radical love. Sermon videos featuring similar themes began appearing on church websites across the country, suggesting that Kristi had tapped into a wellspring of spiritual hunger that many religious leaders had been sensing but hadn't known how to address. The generational divide within American Christianity became impossible to ignore. Surveys conducted in the weeks following her speech revealed that 67% of Christians under 30 agreed with her assessment that faith had become too political, while only 32% of Christians over 50 shared that view. The numbers told a story that political strategists on both sides of the aisle found deeply troubling. The coalition that had powered evangelical political movements for decades was fracturing along generational lines. Back at home, Kristi Noem remained composed in public, but those close to the family reported significant tension behind closed doors. She continued with her press appearances, talked about infrastructure, agriculture, and border security. But the questions kept coming. Was she supportive of Kristi's message? Did she agree with her daughter's portrayal of modern American Christianity? Or was this a personal family crisis, spilling into public view? The governor remained tight-lipped, but her carefully crafted responses revealed the depth of her dilemma. In one interview, she gave a rehearsed answer. "My daughter is strong-minded, and like any young woman, she's finding her own way. I may not always agree, but I'll always love her." It was a safe answer, but also a revealing one. Behind that sentence was tension, complexity, and perhaps even disappointment. Political insiders reported that Noem's team was working overtime to contain the fallout, worried that her daughter's comments might alienate the evangelical base that formed the cornerstone of her support. But Kristi wasn't backing down. If anything, the criticism seemed to strengthen her resolve. She began receiving invitations to speak at universities, progressive churches, and interfaith gatherings. While she declined most of them, her presence in the public discourse had become undeniable. Days after the initial speech, she released a short video on Instagram. Sitting in her car, with sunlight pouring through the windshield, she spoke again with the same quiet conviction that had characterized her original remarks. "I never meant to start a fire," she said, her voice steady despite the storm of controversy swirling around her. "But I also won't apologize for lighting a match. If you're uncomfortable, good. That's where change starts. Jesus didn't make people comfortable. He made them confront themselves." The video was raw, unfiltered, and deeply personal. There were no professional lighting setups, no carefully chosen backgrounds, no team of handlers managing her message. It was just a young woman speaking her truth, and that authenticity resonated powerfully with viewers. The video amassed over 2 million views within 48 hours, with comments ranging from expressions of gratitude to accusations of heresy. And then came the letters. Emails, DMs, handwritten notes, and open blog posts flooded in. Many from young Christians, but just as many from older believers who admitted they'd been silently asking the same questions for years. One letter, from a 62-year-old Sunday school teacher in Missouri, read, "I've been in church all my life, and I think your words were the first time I felt the Spirit move in years. Thank you for giving me permission to ask the questions I've been afraid to ask." Another message, from a former pastor who had left ministry after becoming disillusioned with the politicization of his denomination, simply said, "Thank you for telling the truth out loud. You've reminded me why I believed in the first place." The stories poured in from across the country. A college student in California wrote about how Cassidy's speech had helped her reconcile her progressive political views with her deep faith. A military veteran in Texas shared how her words had given him language to express his discomfort with the way his church had conflated patriotism with worship. A mother in Ohio described how she had used Cassidy's speech as a starting point for conversations with her teenagers about the difference between following Jesus and following a political party. But not all the messages were kind. Some were vicious, revealing the depth of anger and fear that her words had unleashed. "You're a disgrace to your family," one email read. "You're hurting your mother's campaign. You've been brainwashed by liberal lies." Another said, "Don't you ever speak on Jesus again. You're not qualified." The hate mail was loud and relentless, but it only highlighted the point Cassidy was trying to make. If the body of Christ turns on its own when challenged, how strong is that body to begin with? Death threats began arriving at the family home, requiring increased security measures. Online harassment campaigns targeted not just Cassidy, but her friends and even her college professors. The vitriol was particularly intense from accounts associated with Christian nationalism movements, who saw her critique as a direct threat to their ideology, or one that disturbs the status quo and challenges us to live more like the Jesus we claim to follow. Kristi Noem stood in front of her community and asked, "What would Jesus say if he walked into our churches today? What would he think of the way we've used his name to justify policies that harm the vulnerable? What would he say about our tendency to treat political opponents as enemies rather than neighbors?" And maybe the reason her questions hit so hard is because deep down, many of us fear we already know the answers. So where do we go from here? We reflect, we wrestle, we allow discomfort to do its work. Because growth never happens in comfort zones. It happens when we're brave enough to face our own contradictions, to admit that we've turned the Prince of Peace into a pawn of power, and to choose a better path forward. The conversation Cassidy started isn't going away. It's happening in youth groups and Bible studies, in seminary classrooms and denominational meetings, in coffee shops and living rooms across America. Young Christians are asking older generations to account for the way faith has been weaponized. Pastors are reconsidering how they talk about politics from the pulpit. Families are having difficult but necessary conversations about what it means to follow Jesus in a polarized world. Cassidy's story will be remembered, not because she shouted above the noise, but because she whispered truth into a room full of noise. Because she chose to speak when silence would have been safer and more profitable. And because she reminded a nation that sometimes the most revolutionary act of faith is not to declare war on those who disagree with us, but to ask a simple question: are we actually following Jesus, or are we following something else that we've convinced ourselves is the same thing? And that's exactly what she did. The ripples from that October evening in Sioux Falls continue to spread, challenging assumptions, inspiring conversations, and forcing a reckoning with the authentic gospel that has been buried under layers of political calculation and cultural performance. Whether this moment will lead to lasting change in American Christianity remains to be seen. But one thing is certain: A young woman's courage to speak truth has opened a door that cannot easily be closed. So, if this message challenged you, inspired you, or made you think differently, even just for a moment, the conversation doesn't end here. It begins in your community, your church, your family, and your own heart. The questions Cassidy raised aren't meant to be answered quickly or easily. They're meant to be lived with, wrestled with, and allowed to transform us. Let's keep the conversation going. What do you think? Was Cassidy right to speak out? Or should she have stayed silent to protect her family's political brand? Does faith still have a place beyond politics? Or has it already been consumed by the very forces it was meant to transform? And most importantly, what would it look like for each of us to follow Jesus with the same courage and authenticity that she demonstrated that evening? The answers to these questions will shape not just the future of American Christianity, but the future of our democracy itself. Because at its heart, this is about more than politics or religion. It's about truth, courage, and the willingness to speak prophetically in a world that desperately needs to hear an authentic word of hope.